As we consider the general rules of homicide and criminal homicide, we have to consider the rule of a causal statute of limitations that many states impose. We call it affectionately the year and a day rule. And it's actually derived from the common law's position that a criminal prosecution for homicide, criminal homicide, could only be held where the victim died within a year and a day from when the defendant acted, or what some states call the stroke administered by the defendant, the shot, the stabbing, the suffocating. That means if defendant shot the victim on January 1, victim would have to have died within a year and a day for a defendant to be prosecuted for that criminal homicide. He could be prosecuted for other crimes, but not criminal homicide. It was an artificial statute of limitations. It was an artificial way to limit the causation issue. Medical progress had not reached a place where one could speak with confidence, to connect the dots, so to speak, to show that if you shot somebody on January 1, 3 years later, that death occurred because of that shooting. And so they created this artificial time frame of 1 year and a day. Modernly, some states have altered this time frame. Some have abolished the year and a day rule completely. They say to the prosecution, look, if you can prove, connect the dots, if you can prove that our defendant's actions caused that death 5 years later, 10 years later, then you can prove the homicide. Other states, like California, for example, have created a different artificial statute of limitations. They've created something called a presumptive 3 year and a day rule, that within that 3 years and a day, it's presumptively a criminal homicide. After that, prosecutor, roll up your sleeves and try to prove the homicide. So I want you to take the case of a rookie police officer, Walter Barkley, who was shot in 1966. That shooting left him as a paraplegic, and consequently, William Barnes was convicted of attempted murder. He received 16 years in prison. That was 1966. Our officer, Mr. Barkley, died in 2007. And the crime occurred in a state that had abolished the year and a day rule. So the state charged Barnes with murder, claiming that Barkley's death was attributed to the shooting all the way back from 1966. And it was from complications that naturally and foreseeably arise from being a paraplegic. Loss of kidney or other organ function, staph infections, different kinds of complications that occur because one's a paraplegic. Because Pennsylvania had abolished the causal statute of limitations, prosecution said, we're going to go for it. We're going to test this. You might be thinking, but how could they charge him with murder? After all, he was convicted of attempted murder and served time in prison. Isn't this double jeopardy? The answer is no. This is really a new charge with new elements based on new facts. Barkley's death. The last charge was not based on a death. It was based on trying to kill Barkley. So there's no double jeopardy issue here. So there's the trial. What do you think a jury did 41 years later? I don't think it's going to be surprising for you to know. A jury acquitted Barnes in 2010, saying the prosecution didn't prove causation. Could it really say that it was Barnes who was responsible from a shooting 41 years earlier for the death of the police officer in 2007? But as we consider this causal statute of limitations, please don't confuse it with a general statute of limitations for murder. There is no statute of limitations for arresting somebody for murder. If someone shoots and kills a victim in 1966 and that person died immediately, that defendant could be arrested and charged 25 years later. There is no statute of limitations on arrest. The statute of limitations we're talking about here is a causal statute of limitations. That is, from the stroke administered, from what defendant did our victim die within a certain causal limitation? So to recap, on the year and a day rule, what we are looking for, or any of those statute of limitations, is look for the stroke administered, defendant shooting the victim, defendant doing an act that sets in motion, and then we have to see if the death actually occurs within that time frame.